Everybody, hope you're all handling life under quarantine reasonably well this week, and that things are going um, as well as they can for you. Um, Last week, you'll remember that I discussed the appeal of fascism in interwar Italy and interwar Germany. And I noted that fascism was particularly popular among the middle and the upper classes in those countries who feared communism. We talked about the sort of rising popularity of communist politics right after the First World War had ended. Obviously, we've talked about the Bolshevik Revolution, and there's a lot of communist energy in Italy and Germany, and fascism is one of the ways that people respond to this, right? People are afraid that communists will seize their property, that they will seize the state, seize their wealth, etc., and they turn to fascists sort of for protection. This week, I want to expand upon that story a little bit, pick up the story of where the Soviet Union was going in the 1920s, and think about the ways that communism itself is developing now that there is a truly communist state in the world, the first ever. The Soviet Union loomed sort of over every question, every political question in the interwar period. The threat, the idea that a similar revolution could happen to transform the politics, not only of Italy and Germany, but of Britain and France and the United States and countries all over the world. But the Soviet Union itself was changing a lot in this period as well. And to some extent, the country that it became in the 1930s didn't resemble at all the country that it began as after the revolution in 1917. Vladimir Lenin, as we've talked about, was the first head of state for the Soviet Union. He had been the leader of the Bolshevik Party. And he holds that position until he dies in 1924. And then there's a very intense struggle for power among Bolsheviks. Who is going to take over for Lenin is a major question. And his eventual successor is Joseph Stalin. And it's under Stalin, really, that so much of what we understand about the Soviet Union's character. The Soviet Union has a distinct place, a distinct version or type of governance. Communism is practiced there as a distinct type of governance. All of that really develops under Stalin. Okay, Stalin is the general secretary of the Communist Party, which is it's the most important position in the Soviet Union. He's essentially the dictator of the country from the 1920s until his death in 1953. So let's talk a little bit about the changes under Stalin's rule. The early period of Stalin's rule is often referred to as the Second Revolution, because the country was so fundamentally altered economically, politically, socially under early Stalinism. Stalin, as I said, he seized power after very intense struggles, and so he was very sort of paranoid that he might lose his grip on power. And so he works constantly, aggressively to maintain his hold on power and to maintain the Soviet Union's status as a premier power in the world. Here's another picture of Stalin. And at the center of his policies were two major problems that he understood in Soviet life. And the first was the so-called industrial question, and the second was the agricultural question. So let's start with industry. You'll remember that Imperial Russia was among the least industrialized of European powers. It had only begun to industrialize in earnest around 1900, and though it made some gains before World War I, it never really caught up to the rest of Western Europe, and what gains it had made were essentially wiped clear by the First World War, which was so devastating to Russia's economy. And then, of course, the war is followed by the Bolshevik Revolution and then a prolonged civil war between the Bolsheviks and Tsarists. So there's very little industrial development in the country by the 1920s. And Stalin believed that if the Soviets did not quickly and thoroughly, just completely industrialize, if they couldn't match the power of capitalist countries like the US or Britain or Germany, they would be destroyed, right? He said, we are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. He said this in 1931. We must make good this distance in 10 years. Either we do it or we shall go under, right? In other words, the USSR, the Soviet Union, must use the West's own capitalist tools, capitalist industrialization, to defeat the West itself. It's sort of an ironic proposition. But he wants to play the West's game more quickly, more effectively than Western countries are able to do it. And these policies self-consciously invoke international competition. It's all about this competition with capitalist countries and with fascist countries, right? This poster shows us this. It says, who will beat whom? Who beats whom, right? And on our left, we see the Red Star train, which represents, of course, the Soviet Union, communism. And then we see this dark train with a swastika on front representing the fascist threat in Germany. But you might as well add a third train as well, which would represent the capitalist world as well. And this is a question that communists are constantly wondering. Are we going to be able to survive, or are they going to come for us? Because they know, and they're right about this, that capitalist and fascist countries have their eye on toppling the communist regime in the Soviet Union. So to achieve the goal of beating their competition, Stalin unveils what he calls the first five-year plan in 1928, and it would be obviously followed up in years later with other five-year plans. This plan organized down to the very tiniest detail the nation's entire industrial production. How many tons of steel they would produce, how many tons of iron ore they would mine. Every detail is decided upon by the party and then implemented. So this is what you call a planned economy, right? Supply and demand, unlike in our society, supply and demand aren't left up to the market. Consumer choice has nothing to do with how much is produced or where resources are allocated, right? The state itself regulates all production and all consumption. So the five-year plan is focused on very heavy industry, right? It's railroads, power plants, steel mills, military hardware. This is a dam. Key projects of the plan include this dam. This is the Dnipro Dam, which is in Ukraine. At the time of its construction, it's the largest power plant in Europe. The Soviets also erect whole new cities. They build entire new cities in places where there had been very little settlement before, right? There's this industrial complex in the far reaches of Siberia. This is the steel town of Magnitogorsk, right? The magnetic city, in a place where there just had been very little population before. Suddenly you have a steel town on par with places like Pittsburgh or Gary, Indiana, which is the model for Magnitogorsk. So to accomplish these goals, these are almost superhuman feats of development, right? These things are coming together, and this entire city is coming together in a matter of years, right? 2-3 years. The entire plan, right, calls for 5 years to completely industrialize the country. What took other countries 100 years to do or more, the Soviets are trying to do in just the blink of an eye. So how do they do that? Well, one way they do is Stalin limits the production of essentially any other goods that don't directly contribute to the first five-year plan. So consumer household goods, things that families need, some basic necessities, are simply not produced anymore. So the Soviet Union's making these astonishing leaps in industrial development, building whole new cities, vast cities with huge productive power. But the country's standard of living is actually declining throughout this period. In 1933, at the end of the first 5-year plan, the average standard of living for a Soviet worker was worse than it had been before the First World War, right before the revolution itself. So there's a lot of hardship that comes with the first 5-year plan, and yet many Soviet citizens proclaim a sense of joy, a sense of belonging, a sense of absolute belief that this is the right thing to do. They're willing to make these sacrifices. Not all of them, I'll talk about that in a moment, but many are willing to make these sacrifices. They embrace the project, right? They're looking out, by the way, through state-sanctioned media, at a world that's plagued by depression. The Great Depression is in full swing throughout the Western world, and yet communist industry is booming. And many people are very excited by the idea of completing the 5-year plan in 4 years, which is exactly what this poster proclaims: complete the 5-year plan in 4 years. And this is with people carry this spirit into their everyday work. Okay, it's guides and shapes and influences how people are living their lives. And in its most explicit goals, the 5-year plan is wildly successful. By 1939, the Soviet Union is the third most industrialized country in the world. In 10 years, they're there. The US and Nazi Germany are the only two countries with larger gross industrial output than the USSR. And Stalin turns that same level of attention to agriculture. He wants to modernize the countryside. He wants to make agriculture socialist. He wants to eliminate the traditions of old peasant agriculture in Russia and create something entirely new. And his plan is known as collectivization. Okay, and collectivization involves subjecting all aspects of agricultural life, so land, tools, supplies, livestock, certainly peasants themselves, to this kind of top-down reorganization. Okay, and what they do is they merge individual families into larger units, which are then ordered to follow state-mandated production goals. So it's very similar to what you see in these new factories. Okay, we need this much of whatever agricultural good, you know, flax or beets or grain or whatever it is, and they are ordered to achieve then maximum productivity for that good. And these collective units are known, or these individual units are known as collective farms. Okay, so individual family farms are completely obliterated. They don't exist anymore in the Soviet Union at the end of the 5-year plan. And the implications of collectivization are quite clear, right? Peasants are unreliable. The free market is unreliable. Only the state can ensure adequate agricultural production. Collectivization begins in 1929, and it's incredibly brutal, right? I mean, everything I've just described, what it really requires is the complete uprooting of people from their homes, from their land, from their patterns of living, right? Their patterns of work, from the food systems that sustain them, and the attempt to create something entirely new. That's an almost, it is essentially an impossible task unless you're willing to accept enormous human suffering, which the Soviets were absolutely willing to do. Wealthy peasants were the primary victims of collectivization. These guys are called, or these people are called kulaks, K-U-L-A-K. And they were the most opposed to collectivization because they were landowners. They stood to lose the most. They were frequently landlords. And so many times the struggles of collectivization became quite personal, right? Between tenants who felt supported by the Soviet state and felt like they had a lot to gain, and landlords, kulaks, who felt like they had everything to lose. And the Soviet state was very effective at turning those kind of deep personal animosities into public policy. So Stalin himself declares the liquidation of the kulaks as a class. What does that involve? This poster says, "There is no room on our collective farm for priests or kulaks." This poster here, this is a classic caricature of a kulak, right? The fat man, he's comfortable, he's greedy, and it says, "Get the kulaks off the farm." What this actually involves is deportation, deportation to forced labor camps in Siberia. It involved murder, mass executions, and a new term is coined to describe these processes, which is dekulakization. And it's estimated that dekulakization mixed with collectivization more broadly results in the deaths of approximately 5 million people in the early 1930s. This is especially acute in Ukraine, but this is a process that's happening all across the Soviet Union. The production expectations for these farms, meanwhile, were impossibly high, and they were often set by bureaucrats who were from St. Petersburg, they're from Moscow, they didn't know anything about agriculture, but they were members of the party, and being put in charge of a collective farm was sort of a cushy post. It was a nice job. It was a way to show someone a sense of respect. But then that person had no idea how to actually run the farm. But their authority couldn't be questioned because this is a totalitarian regime, and I'm going to talk about what that means in just a minute. So what we end up with is party officials who are afraid that they're not going to get enough output from the farm, and so they go around to individuals and they seize personal rations of grain, right? If you're a party official and your collective farm has not produced enough, you don't want to go to the party meeting and have to say that, right? So they're supplementing with individuals' personal rations, and one of the results of this is mass starvation, right? In order to prop up the party and present an acceptable face at party meetings, thousands and thousands and thousands, eventually millions of people are going to have to starve. Okay. As I said, this is most intense in Ukraine, which was the sort of Soviet breadbasket. Comparison, maybe it's like the Iowa of the Soviet Union, or maybe just the Midwest more broadly. It's a large place. Soviet government needed financing for its industrial projects and its military buildup. And one of the ways that they achieved that financing was they seized grain production from Ukraine and then sold it on international grain markets. Again, this is a capitalist move, but they justify it by saying, we will finance the project of communism, and in the long run, we'll achieve communism, even if we have to adopt some sort of capitalist means to do it. And again, that mixed with party members seizing personal rations creates a truly hellish situation in Ukraine. And as many as 6 million people in Ukraine starve between 1931 and 1933. It's a state-engineered famine. And one of the great atrocities of the 20th century, a century that's filled with atrocities. So collectivization is hideous, it's painful. And by 1935, it's basically the only way that agriculture is practiced in the Soviet Union. And, you know, perhaps surprisingly, perhaps not surprisingly, agricultural output actually declines. So unlike in industrial areas where output is just booming, agriculture does not respond as well to this kind of centralized planning. And one of the reasons for that is that peasants know this is coming, and peasants are very resistant. Even peasants who stand to gain something by seeing a local kulak knocked off its pedestal, they have something to lose in this process too. There's a degree of autonomy that they could lose. And so one of the things that they do is they slaughter animals. They destroy crops. They try and do things that will just subtly or not so subtly, thwart Soviet control over their lives. So collectivization in terms of achieving a degree of policy goals, a degree of control, total control over agriculture is successful, but in the end comes at enormous human costs, right? Millions and millions and millions of deaths, as well as the failure to really make agriculture more efficient, at least in the short term. So by 1932, Stalin proclaims the 5-year plan a success. He says it's been completed months ahead of schedule. But one of the costs is that centuries of tradition, the rhythms of everyday life across the Soviet Union, across Russia, have been uprooted. They've been remade according to the party's ideals, which often don't necessarily align with everyday life. A country of the plow, as one party member proclaims, has become a country of the tractor, right? The country has become industrialized. And Stalin himself receives the credit for these changes. Like Mussolini, like Hitler, Stalin becomes the subject of a state-directed propaganda effort to create like a cult of the leader, right? In the 1930s, Stalin's image is everywhere, to the point that his role extends beyond the head of the party, and he really becomes a sort of father of the people, which this image certainly would indicate, as does this one, right? To oppose the father of the people is a far more significant sin than simply to oppose the head of the party, right? That's the power of the cult of Stalin's leadership. To oppose him is to be an enemy of the people. And we've seen this logic to some extent before with the Jacobins, but it becomes sort of ruling logic of much of Europe, and certainly of the Soviet Union in the 1930s. And it's this logic that feeds the so-called Great Purges of the 1930s. So between 1936 and 1938, as many as 1 million party members, industrial workers, old Bolshevik leaders, army commanders, professors, artists, and many just ordinary citizens were purged from the party through exile or execution. I think the estimates are that more than 600,000, 660,000, something like that, party members were simply shot. And each one was ordered by Stalin himself. And those that weren't shot were sent to forced labor camps where the chance of survival was very low. These people could be arrested, they could be charged based on a very vague and very broad term called anti-Soviet activity. Really, if someone has suggested that you've complained, that you've raised a point that challenges Stalin's ideas, that you've said something that could be even remotely construed as anti-Soviet, you would be charged. And in this era of the Great Purge, to be accused is to be condemned, right? There isn't really any coming back from an accusation. And we see this, we see the deep power of the Great Purge in the ways that the Soviets treated images in this period. You weren't just killed, right? You weren't just sent to Siberia. You were expunged from history, right? This is really the sort of psychology of totalitarian communism. It's that it is the party's hold on truth is so extreme that one who challenges the party must be erased from history. It must seem as if that person had never even existed. Consider this image, for example, or these two images. This is Stalin and Nikolai Yezhev. Yezhev was head of the NKVD, which was a forerunner of the KGB, the secret police of the Soviet Union. Incredibly powerful man. He's standing to Stalin's left here. And he was a victim of the purge. He's also one of the great perpetrators of the purge, right? He's probably responsible for the murder of thousands and thousands of people. But once he slipped on Stalin's bad side, there's no coming back. And so he has to be erased not only from life, but from history. And so the official state photo is the one on our right here. Sometimes they were less sophisticated. This is an Uzbek party member who fell on the wrong side of Stalin, and her face is simply blotted out in official records. And oftentimes, this meant going back in time and looking at historical photos and making sure that those who had fallen on the wrong side of the regime were erased from those as well. This is a picture from 1919. Obviously, this is Lenin here, and the arrow is pointing at Leon Trotsky. Leon Trotsky's the greatest threat to Stalin's power in the 1920s. Once Stalin assumes power, Trotsky has to go into exile in Mexico, where he's eventually assassinated. Because of the threat he represented to Stalin, he's not only murdered, but he's also erased from history. So you see here, same image, and he's gone. He's erased. What is perhaps, I think, scariest about the purges is, well, one, this isn't just high-ranking officials like Trotsky, right? Who people from the inner circle. Yes, you have Trotsky who are targeted. Between 36 and 38, it's 1 in 17 Soviet citizens are targets of the purge. But also, what's stunning about it, and what has to happen for a purge of this scale to take place, is that everyday people are complicit. Okay, the purges demand popular complicity. Average Soviet men and women, they denounce their neighbors, they denounce their co-workers, and they accept the outcomes of the show trials at which many of these people are condemned. They accept, for example, that the old Bolsheviks, like Trotsky, were actually fascists. They accept that people who went into exile to escape Stalin were secretly out to destroy the revolution, destroy the Soviet project, destroy socialism. People really deeply believe these things, right? And there's also a degree of personal advantage involved, right? When you know that the purge is possible or it's happening, and you have a problematic neighbor, or you have a troublesome coworker, or someone who just you're in competition with, there's always the possibility that you could denounce them to remove them as a problem, right? So this is the true horror, I think, of the purges, is that it turns everybody against one another, almost like a witch trial, but on a mass industrial scale, right? So Stalin built Russia. He built a strong Russia, really, out of the rubble of the First World War, out of the rubble of the Revolution and the Civil War. And he transforms in the process the economic base of Soviet Russia. There is a new culture here. This is, despite the fear, despite the paranoia, there's also a great deal of confidence and pride and optimism in the Soviet Union during the 1930s. But the cost is so high. The cost is terror, suspicion, paranoia, and of course, death on an almost unimaginable scale. How does this compare with fascism? Let's think about this for a few seconds here. We talked last week about the horrors of fascism. We'll talk more about them next week. But how do these systems are developing simultaneously? To what extent are they similar or not? This is one of the major questions of 20th century social science. People spent the first half of the 20th century sort of falling into totalitarianism, and they spent the second half of the century trying to explain it. And scholars today will still explore these questions. Timothy Snyder, Ann Applebaum, other historians have wondered what the experiences of Nazism and Stalinism in particular had in common with one another. We know there's ideological differences, right? We know that fascists, for one, believe, they build their system around the idea of race and blood and nation. And communists don't do that, right? Communists are fundamentally internationalist. They believe in the idea of class, and the working class in the Soviet Union is aligned with the working class of the United States or Germany, what have you. They see the world exclusively in terms of socioeconomic privilege and exploitation. And the two groups see each other as enemies, right? Fascists and communists see each other as the true enemy. The liberals are sort of in the middle here, and both will go to war with liberal states. But their real arch enemy, the ones that they're most paranoid about, are fascists and communists, or are one another. For Hitler, we saw this in Mein Kampf when we read that selection last week. Soviet communism was as pernicious as Judaism. They were one and the same, right? And Nazis frequently conflate the two. And for Stalin and the communists more broadly, fascism was the greatest threat. It was a greater threat even than capitalism. And Stalin himself becomes sort of the leading anti-fascist voice of the interwar period until he builds an alliance with Hitler, which I'm going to talk about at the end of this lecture. For all that they do seem to have in common, or all of their differences, they actually have a lot in common. These two civilizations have structural similarities. And the most important thing that they have in common is that they both see the state, right, the government, as the essential tool for building their ideal societies. Okay, unlike liberals who believe the government should be limited, right, that there's room for private life and a market, fascists and communists do not believe that. Okay, the state is everything. Let's talk about this term, though, totalitarianism, for a second here. The term was coined by an Italian journalist, a liberal, an anti-fascist named Giovanni Amendola in 1923. It was an explicit criticism of Mussolini's fascism, Mussolini's methods. For this and for his other criticisms of fascism, Amendola was murdered by the Black Shirts in 1926. But over time, fascists actually appropriate the term. They begin to use this term, totalitarianism, because they think it's actually quite fitting. There's a fascist philosopher, Giovanni Gentile, who really is the true author of the Mussolini piece we read last week. Mussolini just sort of attached his name to it. And Gentile argued that in the totalitarian model, the state will provide total representation of the nation and total guidance towards national goals, right? Total representation of the nation. There is no difference between the people and the state. Okay, the state is not just some institution that's meant to sort of support private life. The state is the society. Okay, and total guidance towards national goals. There is no way to have agriculture or industry under a totalitarian state outside of what the state prescribes. Okay, you will not be growing your own little crop of tomatoes, right? You will not be working on your car in your driveway, right? All of that labor must be directed towards state prescribed national goals. Okay. It's really not until after World War II that social scientists begin to develop theories of how these regimes are similar. To begin to notice that totalitarianism doesn't just apply to the fascists, it also applies to the Soviet Union under Stalin. And much of the breakthroughs in this theoretical work are due to Hannah Arendt. Her 1951 book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, is still sort of the central touchstone treatise about totalitarianism. Arendt herself was a victim of totalitarianism. She was a German Jew. She fled to France in the 1930s. After the fall of France to the Germans, she flees to the United States in 1941. And this is her her great innovation, is to recognize that the fascist regimes in the Soviet Union actually have so much in common. Right? Until that point, everyone saw them as sort of diametrically opposed. Arendt argued that totalitarianism was a distinctly 20th century phenomenon. Okay, this is a hyper-modern version of governance. It's different than, say, 18th century absolutism that we talked about at the very beginning of the semester. Absolutist monarchs demand a lot, but really what their demands amount to is outward obedience. Okay, you have to show your fealty to the king. You have to remind yourself that you are a subject of the king. That's the goal. The fascists and the communists, they want much more than that. Okay, totalitarian states demand a deeper sort of self-discipline, a deeper attachment to the government. What they want is a complete transformation of their subjects' minds, an erasure of any sense that as an individual, you are different than the rest of the society. Okay, they want to eliminate the idea of individual autonomy, and they want people to conflate themselves completely with the regime. Okay, every single life, a soldier, a school teacher, a student, a bureaucrat, a factory worker, whatever it is you do, should be dedicated entirely to furthering the goals of the state, and each subject needs to internalize this mission. They have to believe completely in it. They have to completely commit themselves to it. And totalitarian states are able to achieve this to an unbelievable scale, right? And they're able to do that through mass communication. They control the radio, the newspapers, the bureaucracy, right? There is not an area of life that you would encounter, at least not an official or public one, that you would encounter that isn't sort of brought within the regime and used to further the goals of the regime. This is especially apparent among children who knew really no other life beyond the totalitarian state, and their lives are sort of very easily controlled by the state. In an almost ironic sense, you could say that totalitarianism, even though it attempts to destroy individualism, also in some ways is more intensely individualistic than even a liberal society would be, right? And I know this is kind of a weird and complex argument to make here, but just consider Russia, for example. Consider Stalin's Russia. Prior to the revolution, and even in the very early years after the revolution, if you had a problem in life, you could theorize or criticize the society around you to explain the problem. Okay, so say you, what's a good example problem? Say a worker is injured on the job. Okay, you work in one of the czar's factories and you are hurt. That can easily then be attributed to the ways that capitalism has little regard for individual life and puts workers at risks to enhance the profits of the czar. Okay, that would be a pretty standard socialist critique of worker injury on the job. Okay, you could say that the working conditions are exploitive. If a peasant were to starve under the czar, you could say, well, this is obviously because of the greed of the bourgeoisie. And capitalism cannot possibly protect the welfare of working people. Okay, now, after the revolution, and especially under Stalin, how would someone explain a worker being injured on the job or a peasant starving? In the earlier era, you blame society. That is no longer possible though, right? Because under a totalitarian state, the society cannot be wrong, or the state itself cannot be wrong. The great leader who controls the state, whether it's Hitler or it's Mussolini or it's Stalin, can't be wrong. And because they control everything in the civilization, your injury is now entirely on you. There are no more social explanations for what happens to you, right? If you starve, it's because you were a weak comrade. It's because you did not produce enough for your own survival, or your community was unwilling to accept you because you threatened the overall goals of the civilization. And to a remarkable degree, individuals internalize this and they accept it. Okay. I think that it's easy for us to imagine that everybody in the Soviet Union was actually a liberal subject, and they actually had a very clear sense of who they were, and they had to make choices every day. Do I agree with this, with the regime, or do I not agree with the regime? Should I resist or should I not resist? But that's not really how it was. In fact, people internalize these things, and when they wake up in the morning, they're concerned with making sure that they are able to live as productive Soviet citizens, to contribute, to not be a parasite, right? They feel an obligation to the state. They want to meet that obligation. And of course, many people did not meet the obligations, okay, even those that wanted to. And for both Stalin and Hitler, the ends of the state, the achievement of a fascist state or the achievement of a communist state, justify extreme measures, extreme means: coercion, internment, starvation, murder, conquest. These are simply tactics or strategies for reconstructing the world to meet an ideal vision. As Stalin very famously said, one death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. And statistics are how states are built, right? This is very blasé, but it's also a philosophy of governance that both of these regimes rely on. Both Soviet communism and Nazism rely on fears of enemies to enhance citizens' loyalty to the state. We see this in Mein Kampf. Hitler is very conscientious about how he constructs fear of the enemy to build a sense of loyalty on everyone else's part towards him. For communists, these are class enemies: czarists, priests, kulaks. For Nazis, it's racial enemies: it's Jews, it's Slavs, or it's any supposedly subhuman other who might weaken German blood. Okay. And these regimes also rely on a cult of the leader, right? A sort of religious elevation. And I've referenced this a few times already so far with Stalin, but it's a sort of religious elevation of the leader to a figure of worship. The leader is a man of action, right? The leader gets things done. He loves the country. He is the country. He represents the people's essence. He represents their traditions. He will make them great. He fights for them. He belittles his opponents or crushes them. Any fact or any idea that seems to tarnish his image, he declares false, right? And the people have to accept that. This is sort of cult-like behavior, but it's how totalitarian states operate. It's how they control millions and millions of people within their populations. And it's really easy for us, I hope, to respond with revulsion and horror at totalitarianism, in part because we know that there's millions of lives that are going to be claimed by these civilizations. But it's also important, this is very important, to imagine being part of the collective, okay? To imagine participating in these events from a very young age, as we see here. And especially to imagine that in light of the hardships of the First World War, how much people had suffered. For citizens of fascist or communist totalitarian states, this is an exhilarating experience. It's a hard one, but it's often described as with a sort of spiritual ecstasy. People feel as though they've been merged into something greater than themselves, that their lives have real purpose, and that every single day is filled with that purpose. And we see that in both of these totalitarian regimes, fascist and communist. Resisting the pull of this might seem easy, right? You could watch a million movies about the Nazis, and in every one you would imagine, like, oh, here's what I would do if I faced these things. You could do the same thing with the Soviets. If I found myself there, here's the strategy I would take to avoid it. And we do that because we live in a society that celebrates individualism. Individual autonomy is everything to us. But within these civilizations, resistance, not only was it difficult, right? It almost becomes an irrelevant concept. It to some extent doesn't even exist, because citizens had so little sense of themselves apart from the regime, right? That's not to say that nobody resisted. These things happened, but for most people, for the masses of people, it's not a feasible concept. Okay, let's finish up with a few thoughts about how all of this leads to war. And I'm going to try to move quickly here because I know I'm taking a little bit of your time. So you'll remember that one of the goals of the Paris Peace Conference that leads to the Treaty of Versailles is to prevent another war. That's what everybody's thinking about in 1918, 1919, 1920. Many people are afraid there's no stopping it, but that's the goal. Anyway, certainly that's the goal of Woodrow Wilson, the great idealist of Paris. But the treaty really has the opposite effect. And it actually sets the stage for and is really at the center of many of the causes of World War II. Let's focus on Hitler in particular and how he responds to the treaty. In Mein Kampf, this is a section we didn't read, he establishes a philosophy of Lebensraum. This is the German word for living space or habitat. And he argues that it's the nation's destiny to expand the Lebensraum by seizing land in Eastern Europe from lesser, undeserving people who occupied it, right? Lebensraum is the natural habitat of the German people. But in what he considers the natural habitat of the German people are those who are not German. And he wants to expand the nation's borders to move German-speaking and ethnically German people into that land and depopulate it of anybody else, right? So he calls this space without people, okay? And of course there are people there. And this is, by the way, what he envisions as the Lebensraum. So this is, if we see Germany's borders at the time ending about here, this is just an approximation. And here, that's actually much bigger. It's more like this. And he wants to move far east into Russia, into Norway and Sweden, east even, or west, sorry, over Belgium and the Netherlands and Denmark, and certainly over Czechoslovakia, Poland, etc. Calls this space without people. Obviously, there are people in these lands, but especially to the east, they're Slavic people. And as Hitler would understand it, that means they're undeserving of the land. They can't properly use the land as Germans would. And so the land rightfully belongs to the Germans and it must be appropriated and populated with Germans. And this is a project that I'm not going to go into great detail about this. I will talk here about how Germans seize and annex all of this territory. But many Germans are also in a sort of version of what in the US we had was the Homestead Act. Many Germans are settled into these lands. Okay, the land is taken from Slavs, German people are placed onto it. So they actually do begin to affect these policies. But let's talk about the seizure of the land. So once in power, Hitler is acting on these theories immediately. Remember, Mein Kampf is written in the 20s when he's in prison. He comes to power in 1933, and he's instantly trying to expand German territory. In 1935, he just says the Treaty of Versailles is null and void. It's over. Okay, and no one stops him from saying that. There's no one to say, well, actually, no, it's not. Right? He says it's null and void, and it is. And one of the first moves he makes that would have been in violation of the treaty is he introduces military conscription and he begins building an air force and a navy. The treaty had said that the Germans could not have armed forces of any meaningful size. Ordinary Germans are ecstatic, right? They saw that the no military rule as a very oppressive measure, and they love this, right? He's doing it even though they said he couldn't do it. In 1936, Hitler sends troops into the demilitarized zone of the Rhineland here, which is to the west, again, an ethnically German region that the French had said could not have any military buildup whatsoever, and the French were extracting wealth as well from the Rhineland. Hitler moves his new military in, and he begins constructing military bases and constructing weapons, etc., with the industrial infrastructure that's already there. This is an outright violation of Versailles as well. And what he says is, who's going to stop me? And here are German troops marching into the Rhineland, and here we see citizens saluting them with this Nazi salute. Okay, in March 1938, Hitler pushes through the so-called Anschluss. This is the territorial union of Germany and Austria. That's a fancy way of saying it's the forced annexation of Austria by Germany. Once again, like Hitler's militarization of the Rhineland, his construction of a German military, this is a violation of Versailles. Now you can see on this map, this is Austria to the south of Germany here. Once the Anschluss has been effected, Germany now surrounds this part of Czechoslovakia, which today we would call the Czech Republic, which is a historically German-speaking and ethnically German region known as the Sudetenland. Okay. And ethnic Germans in the region are very excited by this. They've lived in tension with the Czech government for a long time. They're German nationalists, and they welcome the idea of Nazi Germany taking over their territory. Less delighted is the Czech government, and they resist. And this is the first example of a state resisting Hitler's offensives during the 1930s. And for a few months through the summer of 38, this actually works, right? Hitler holds off. But he's cultivating unrest among ethnic Germans in Czechoslovakia in the meantime. And what he also succeeds in doing is getting the leaders of Britain and France, and then of course his ally Mussolini, to come to Munich for a conference in September of 1938 to discuss this crisis of his own making in the Sudetenland. And what happens very quickly, this is to the left here, shaking Hitler's hand, is the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain. What happens very quickly is Britain and France allow the annexation. Hitler says, this is my last time, I'm not going to do it anymore. He says it's his final land grab. And Neville Chamberlain, go back and look at him for a moment here. He says he goes home to Britain and he's ecstatic, celebratory. He says, with diplomacy instead of war, we've secured peace in our time. Okay, this is a sort of diplomatic win, at least in Britain. And then soon after, the Germans move into the Sudetenland, and Britain and France, as agreed, do nothing. These are ethnic Germans celebrating the German arrival in Czechoslovakia. But in 1939, Hitler, in violation of his promise, annexes all of Czechoslovakia. So we can see from this map the extent of Hitler's Lebensraum policies by 1939, by early 1939, right? The Treaty of Versailles in the trash. Hitler's now turning his attention to Poland, okay, which is pretty clearly marked on this map. This raises a new level of concern because if the Nazis invade Poland, they will now share a border with the Soviet Union, with Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union. So Stalin reaches out to Britain and France to broker a deal. They spurn him. They say, no, I mean, Hitler's not our problem. We're not going to deal with that. And so Stalin decides to go to the table with his arch rival, the fascists, Nazi Germany. Um, and in 1939, Hitler and Stalin signed an agreement, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And this is a bombshell. So this is Ribbentrop. He's the foreign minister of Nazi Germany, sort of like the Secretary of State. And this is, of course, Stalin at the signing of the pact. This is a bombshell. The Nazis and the communists are mortal enemies. We saw in Mein Kampf Hitler's visceral hatred of Bolshevism as well as Slavs. Well, here he has the most, the face of Bolshevism in the world at the table, and he's signing an agreement with him. And Stalin, like I said before, is the sort of leading fascist critic in Europe. And here they are, they pledge, if nothing else, not to attack one another. But they actually did secretly agree to more. And what they agree to is carving up Eastern Europe for one another's benefit. So basically what they're saying is we will stand back as one another seize more and more territory throughout Eastern Europe. So the Soviets are going to seize Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland up to the Vistula River, sort of half of Poland, and Germany is going to take the rest. And they do exactly that. So by 1941, the agreement deteriorates once they've sort of seized all the land that they could, and they do declare war on one another, of course. That opens up the grueling Eastern Front as the Nazis attempt to invade the Soviet Union. But that's still sort of a long way off. I'm going to give you a whole lecture about that next week. That's still a long way off in 1939. In September of 1939, Hitler, again in violation of that Munich agreement that he'd made with Chamberlain and made with the French, he invades Poland. And so finally, in response to that, there is no more looking the other way, and Britain and France declare war on Germany. So this is a really quick summary of the 1930s. I haven't even discussed Italy's conquest of Ethiopia, which is from a similar philosophical perspective as the Lebensraum, right? This is the sort of natural land of the Italian people, and we are going to conquer it. I haven't discussed the Spanish Civil War, which begins in 1936 and is sort of a rehearsal for World War II, in which Stalin and Hitler are pumping, and Mussolini are pumping resources and people into Spain and fighting sort of a proxy war. And I haven't discussed the formation of the German-Italian Axis alliance, although that's a little bit more straightforward. These are the two great fascist powers, and they of course agree to support one another. But I want to wrap up quickly here with just a few thoughts about the French and British approach. Why they responded like they did. Knowing what we know about Nazi Germany, and we know a lot about Nazi Germany, it's hard to make sense of this decision that they call appeasement. Why would you appease Hitler? Why would you give him what he wanted? Why didn't the French step in and stop the militarization of the Rhineland? Why did Britain and France agree to the Sudetenland annexation? And then why not do anything once all of Czechoslovakia was conquered? This is a place where historical thinking is of great value. Okay, it's very easy to simply blame feckless and weak leaders, and I think there's plenty of room for that. I think that's completely appropriate to fail to gauge who Hitler really was. But if we think historically, we can also begin to imagine where those leaders were coming from a little bit, right? World War I was less than 20 years earlier. We've discussed the enormous social and economic tolls of that war. It was, for all of its participants, essentially the apocalypse. Britain had lost nearly 1 million young men in 4 years, not counting 2 million wounded. Those are casualty numbers that eclipse anything even imagined in American history. France lost 1.4 million men and 4.3 million wounded. That's an entire generation just wiped out. And in many ways, it broke those countries. They could not move past the memory of the First World War. Right? It haunted every decision they made. And these are democratic countries as well, right? No democratically elected leader wants the responsibility for starting another war. And so they're hesitant, they're shaken, and they shrug at Hitler and his aggressive policies. Neville Chamberlain famously claimed the Sudetenland controversy was a quarrel in a faraway country, Czechoslovakia, between people of whom we know nothing, right? What he's saying is, it's not our problem. We have our own problems. It's the Great Depression, right? We have our own issues at home. We don't need to worry about that. And the last time we got involved, it was apocalyptic. And both Chamberlain and French Prime Minister Edouard Daladier had popular support for these positions, right? There's little support, like there had been in 1914, there's really little support for war. As the British poet laureate John Masefield wrote to Chamberlain, to ask that young men's bodies, not yet dead, be given from the battle not yet begun. Imagine giving another generation to a war and then stop yourself from doing it. But all of these hopes, here's the problem. All of these hopes were based on trust. Trust that Hitler would do as he said. Okay, if he did, then there could be some real value in these policies. But he did not, right? And they realized too late what kind of person they were trying to negotiate with. That's where I'm going to leave it for today. Next week, we're going to move into a discussion of the Eastern Front. We're going to talk about the Holocaust. We'll talk about the war in some greater detail. I hope everybody is staying safe, staying healthy, and staying reasonably sane inside your home. And I will talk to you this week. Thanks, everybody.